Shalom and welcome back to the Restrainer in the midst of. We are coming down to the waning programs in this issue because we've been weaving this in with the story of Cain and Ishmael and Esau and the Hyksos and the heir of Rob, and you've been weaving that with the beast and the restrainer and the thorns and the thistles and the chaff and the stubble and straw and so forth. And so we're bringing all these things together in the close of these last couple of programs dealing with Esau. And when we left off last time, we were going back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, if you remember, and establishing that the context and the subject of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is the end of days. The subject was the man of perdition, the son of perdition, the man of sin, the same thing that Judas is called, who is taken out of the midst of the 12 and revealed as to who he is, and now we know who he is. And we have the same thing going on with the other son of perdition in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, when Paul reveals to us in verse 6 and 7 that now you know who is it that restrains. And he is now in the world. He's operating in the world as we speak. And there will be a time when he's taken out of the midst of us and cast down into earth. And we're going to read a little bit of that in Revelation chapter 12. I believe it's Michael the archangel that will be casting him out. And we'll read that a little bit later. And now we know who he is. He's no longer ubiquitously, which is just a fancy word for unseen and everywhere, in the midst of us. Now the jig is up for him and he knows who he is. And we were talking about John's comments, if you will, also that he is in the world and there's many of them and he's already in the world. And now we're going to go to Isaiah. If you can bring that up very quickly, David, we're going to go to the quote of Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 17. I'm sorry that it's not written up there. I don't know why it isn't, but listen to what's said here very carefully. They that see you shall narrowly look upon you and consider you, saying, is this the man? Now remember, this is Lucifer, son of the morning, that fell. You know the 5 I wills. I will ascend unto heavens. I will be like the Most High. And then it goes on to say, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof? And notice that he opened not the house of his prisoners, i.e. once again, holding on to something, just like Pharaoh did, as, if you will, as prisoners or slaves to the system, not letting them go into Mount Sinai once again, much less the promised land. This is the nature of the enemy. Now we go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 8 and we read, and then shall that lawless one be revealed, whom the Lord Yahweh shall consume with the spirit of his mouth and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Now, let me give you a couple of reminders of this satar again before we go on. Remember, satar is the only Hebrew word that adds up to 666 that contains 3 consonants, and it means to hide or to conceal. And the reason I have hides himself there is because this is the context of its first occurrence in Genesis 4:13 in the life of Cain. These are some reminders as we start to wrap these things up. Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from your face I shall, literally in the Hebrew, hide myself, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. Remember, this was said of Judas as well. And it shall come to pass that everyone that finds me shall slay me. Now in Jeremiah chapter 49 verse 10, with respect to Esau, we are told, I have made Esau bare, I have uncovered, that's the Hebrew word galah, which is the root of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation in Hebrew is het galut. Het galut, which is based upon this root, G-A-L-A-H, galah. And it's the Hebrew word for the base of the exile as well. But here it's to uncover, reveal his satar, his secret places. There's a prophecy in the end of days of which his secret places are going to be revealed. And it's talking about making Esau bare. He shall not be able to hide himself. His seed is spoiled. In other words, his seed is going to end, and his brethren and his neighbors, and he is not. Now remember Mark chapter 4:13. And he said unto them, Know ye not this parable? How then will you know all parables? David, leave this up for a little bit. Once again, we're going to go back to the parable of the sower, and all these parables have something to do with the parable of the sower, and the parable of the wheat and the tares has a meaning of to understand all the parables. So when we go to Matthew 13 verse 25, notice again, while men slept, we're reviewing here, the enemy came, sowed tares among, that is mason, in the midst of the wheat, and went his way. In Matthew 13:49, we're quoting again, So shall it be at the end of the world. The angel shall come forth and sever the wicked from the midst of the just. This is the constant painting from the very beginning. Now in Isaiah chapter 14 verses 13 through 15, remember we just read about the man who's going to be revealed, who holds back and won't let his prisoners go. Where is he dwelling in the midst of again? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit. So where is he going to exalt his throne? Above the stars of God. We're going to talk about who the stars of God are here. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High, yet you shall be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. Now, come on back to me for a minute, David. I want to mention something that's also contained in this verse. First of all, we're going to talk about these stars for a little bit. But I also want you to see that from Hasatan, or from Satan's point of view, from his point of view, the idea is to ascend, to rise up, to exalt himself above the stars of God. One of the fundamental deceptive teachings of the last 6,000 years. Yeah, from the very beginning. Because I believe the devil or the beast or the bad guy himself started this whole thinking process as it's revealed here in Isaiah chapter 14, which eventually became what we call today the theory of evolution. The whole idea that man is ascending and starting out in chaos in a primordial soup pond and eventually progressing to become the bright, spotless entity it is today. The Bible teaches the opposite. Known empirical science teaches the opposite. It's the other way around. Man started out perfect, and because man thumbs his nose at God, and always has, man is going spiraling down. And the only reason why man is able to be maintained upon this earth is because God is attempting to restore His Torah to every generation, not to save them, only the Messiah saves you, but to bless you and cause you to produce much fruit so you don't melt away with a fervent heat. So even though His desire, which He teaches all religious systems, I believe, the progression to exalt, the Father reminds Him at the end that you shall be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. So that's the Father's way of saying, sorry, things are going in a downward spiral, not an upward spiral. Now let's bring this back up, David. I want to go back to the stars concept now, because He's going to be in the midst, or rise Himself above the stars of God. In Genesis 22:17, and repeated again in Revelation 1:20, it says, in blessing I will bless you, in multiplying I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven and the sand upon the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. So the stars of heaven and the sand and the sea is all those who come from the loins of, or come from Abraham. Not physically his loins is not what it's talking about. It's talking about God's seed in Abraham, and we've gone over that enough times in past sessions. And so then when you get to Revelation 1:20, it says, the mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in your right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 churches and the 7 candlesticks. So the stars are the messengers. The stars are us. The stars are used in Scripture to describe the people who are following God. When you go to Obadiah, verse 4, it says, though you exalt yourself as the eagle, and though you set your nest among the stars. There's our word, in the midst of. Though you set yourself in the midst of us, the wheat, it's just compared to stars here. Thence will I bring you down, saith Yahweh. Now, if we saw the context of Obadiah, we would see that Obadiah is all about Edom. Edom is Esau once again. In Isaiah 46:10, remember that God declares out of the beginning the end, and out of ancient times the things that are not yet done. So when we go back to the beginning in the story of Cain, we see the very first words in chapter 4, verse 3. And out of the end of days it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto Yahweh. That word in your King James English is generally translated as in the process of time, but in Hebrew it's maketz yamin. Literally, out of the end of days. So what am I saying? You go to the beginning and you get a revelation of the end in the life of Cain. You go to the end and it tells you that it's back in the beginning. The ending is in the beginning, and the beginning is in the end. And so we also read on of the life of Cain once again. The concept of satar, being hidden, and fugitives and wanderers on the earth. Keep this in mind. This has been a consistent pattern from the very beginning. Now, come on back to me, David, for just a few minutes. Now, what I want to do now is I want to take you back to a very special place in the very beginning, in which Abraham is going to offer up his son, his only son, up on Mount Moriah. Many of us are probably very familiar with this story. But I want you to keep this concept in mind of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the restrainer. Something holding something back. Because what I'm proposing here is that the general or traditional understanding of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is that the Holy Spirit's been holding back the devil. And I'm going to submit to you now, think logically here. God forbid that we would do that. When we think about the context here and everything that we've been reading over these past weeks, when we get to this concept of Him being in the midst of us, and that the context and the subject is the man of sin, the son of perdition, and we know that as long as he is in the world, he's creating havoc. He's creating chaos. He's not just keeping the wheat from producing fruit, which is what I proposed to you. The tares, as long as they're in the world, are keeping the fruit from producing wheat from producing fruit. And the minute the weeds are taken out of the garden, now the plants can start to thrive. That's the whole point. But if all the plants in your garden look like the weeds, then Yeshua is saying, don't go out and pull up the weeds, else you'll pull up the kumquats with them. But once kumquats start looking like kumquats, once tomatoes start producing tomatoes, then you can say, well, hey, these aren't weeds. It's these things over here that are just dull-looking, non-producing, inedible things sticking out of the ground. That's the weeds. And so now you go pull them. So if all this time He's been in the midst of us, keeping us from producing fruit, wreaking havoc, stealing, killing, destroying, and corrupting, why would the Holy Spirit been all this time keeping Him from being revealed? Does that make any sense to you? Of course it doesn't make sense. Most people already have a presupposition of what's going on there before they even read the text. And it may sound logical unless you put it back into its context, especially if your context is starting in the beginning and not the middle, or not just the verse before and the verse afterwards. So with this in mind, holding something back, keeping things from happening, that is what I'm going to submit to as the whole concept of the restrainer. Now we go back to the story of Abraham and his son Isaac. Now if you remember, once again, the father says, Abraham, take your son, your only begotten son. Now, was Isaac Abraham's only begotten son? No. Not only was he not his only begotten son, he wasn't Abraham's firstborn. What the father, once again, I remind you, was saying to Abraham is, take my firstborn up to the mountain, not your firstborn. Because Abraham's firstborn, in other words, in the flesh, was Ishmael. But God's firstborn was in Isaac. Why? Because Isaac is the one who received God's word. And Abraham is the model for that. That's why he's referred to as our father Abraham. Why? Because he's the model of all that is righteous. He's the model of what redemption and the fruit, the seed and the fruit is all about. That's why it's referred to as Abraham's seed. But we are trained to think that Abraham's seed is speaking of the physical seed of Abraham. I submit to you, no, it is not. It's referring to God's seed in Abraham. And how was that received? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. That's how it's received. Then, that was in Genesis chapter 15. Then 11 chapters later, the Father's going to show you how the fruit works, how the continuation of the seed works. In Genesis chapter 26, verse 4 and 5, the Father's going to say, once again, Abraham, your seed's going to bless all the nations of the earth. Now, was he talking about his physical seed? No. His physical seed was Ishmael. Ishmael's not blessing all the nations of the earth. It's God's seed in Abraham that was also in Isaac. Remember, Paul said, in Isaac thou shalt be called. That's going to bless all the nations of the earth. And that's why Genesis 26, verse 5 says, because, very important word. Abraham, your seed's going to bless all the nations of the earth because you obeyed my voice. He's already got the seed. Now he's going to keep the commandments of God because you obeyed my voice, my statutes, and my commandments, it says. Genesis chapter 26, verse 5. It says Torah, because you obeyed my Torah. Well, the average person's thinking, well, wait a minute, I thought the Torah didn't come from Mount Sinai. No, the Torah for Israel as a nation altogether came at Mount Sinai. The Torah has been there from the beginning. The fruit has been there from the very beginning. That's nothing new. Once again, that's just true. And so when he says take Isaac up there, he's saying take my firstborn, which was Isaac, up to the mountain. And so David, bring this back up now in Genesis chapter 22, verse 8. We know the story is that he tells him to go up there. Remember, they take the wood and they take the fire and he takes a knife and we go up to the mounts. And when we get there in verse 8, it says, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them up there together. My son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. Now pay attention to that, because ram, that's actually something innocent, of course, is what's going to be sacrificed. And when they get up there, of course, we know in verse 12, he says, lay not your hand upon the lad, neither do anything unto him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now come back to me again, David. So let's set the story up again. He tells him to take his only son up there, Isaac, which is once again God's firstborn, not Abraham's firstborn. When he gets up there, they're going to have an offering, and he says, but God's going to take care of the offering. He'll provide himself a lamb for the offering. And so we know that when it comes time for it, Isaac is spared. And that Abraham here, as I bring it up here in a few minutes, is going to go get a ram caught, that's our word restrainer in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, caught in a thicket. But one thing at a time. So I want to submit to you something first of all, and I don't mean to burst anybody's bubble here, but I want us to see that one of the things I believe that religious people, or at least people who see the Bible as their source of life and understanding, and that they are saved by the blood of the Messiah and they understand all those things, that sometimes we forget that Yeshua, our Messiah, has a head and a body. That he's not just a head. Sometimes I think we forget that, because I think, for example, when the Messiah returns and he's fighting and so forth, even building a house, for example. John chapter 14, we know that that Yeshua is building something, if you will. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in the Father, believe in God, believe also in me. For I go to prepare a place for you. So where I am, there you may be also. You're familiar with the verses in John chapter 14. And sometimes I think we forget that when he says that Yeshua has a body and that it's not the head that makes houses. Let me just think about it for a minute. When it comes to a person, it's not the head that makes the house. The head's the only one. The head is the one that gives the directions. A person's head tells the body what to do, tells the hand to move. But when you build a house, the head's not out there on the construction project banging nails. You ever see anybody's head banging nails out there? No, it's the hands, i.e. it's us. It's us that's out there building this thing. We're not expected until the Messiah comes to just lay around on the couch watching American Idol all day while the Messiah takes care of everything. We are intimately involved in these things in the end time. And that's one of the things I believe the Father's trying to restore back to His people in the latter days, that we are every bit a part of what's going on. And so we've been traditionally taught, now bear with me a minute, we've been traditionally taught that Isaac is a beautiful picture of the Messiah on the tree, going up to Abraham to be sacrificed on the mount, okay? Now what I'm going to submit to you is this. I'm submitting to you that it's not so much that Isaac is a picture of the Messiah so much as the body of Messiah, i.e. us. Us. Because even though he was a figure or similitude of actually dying up there, when you go back to the reality of what took place, Isaac did not die, did he? It was the ram that was caught in a thicket that actually was sacrificed on that altar. That's why I submit to you that Isaac is a better picture of us, you and me, who should, by all intents and purposes, because of our sins, we should have gone to that altar. But instead, he sacrificed a ram. See, God would take care of it himself in our place. So I believe Isaac is a picture, more of a picture of you and I, i.e. the body of Messiah up on that altar. And so you'll notice that he goes and gets a ram, and it's actually the ram that's sacrificed on the altar. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that, well, let's bring the verse up here. Bring up the next one. I believe it's up here, David. Bring up the next verse. First occurrence of the one who restrains. That's what I have titled this, because we're talking about the restrainer in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So the very first occurrence of this one who restrains, I submit to you, is the first occurrence of this Greek word kateko, which is in Genesis chapter 22, verse 13. Here's what it says. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, behind him a ram caught, held on in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram. In other words, he seemed to be involved in the taking of this ram and offering him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. If you will, he snatched it away from this thicket. And remember who the thickets and the thistles and the tares and the thorns are in the field. A thicket in Hebrew is this concept of things, a tangling mess that he was caught in by his horns. Now, it's no coincidence, I believe, that ram, the word for ram, agil, is the basis for Elohim. Elohim is the Hebrew word translated as God. And the ancient picture of God in the Hebrew culture was several things. Number one, it was a, keep this up here, David, by the way. It was an ox head. The very first letter of Elohim is an aleph, which represents and is pictured by the ox head. And the reason why that was a representation of the power and strength of God is because that was a demonstrative example of His power and His strength. If you've ever seen two rams collide, then you would understand the strength and the power of a ram. And so that was an earthly representation, not to be worshipped, but an earthly understanding of something seen so we could grasp something that was unseen. So something that ends up being the root of the word for God is caught in a thicket, and that's what was actually taken up on the altar and sacrificed, is something that ends up being the root meaning behind the word for God. And notice the first occurrence of our word kateko, which in Hebrew is achaz, which means to seize or to grasp or to hold on to something. It literally, pictographically, means to be fenced in by a strong weapon. Is literally what the aleph and the chet and the zayin means in our Hebrew word achaz, translated as a restrainer here. Now, come on back to me for a minute as we conclude this program. I'm going to suggest to you that the enemy did not want the ram to go to the altar. He wanted to keep it from happening because he wanted Isaac to have to actually go and pay the penalty for his own sins. But the Father knew that could never be. He knew that man could never do that. Only the Messiah could do that. So we'll continue that concept when we come back next week. We'll continue the idea of the ram being held onto, held back in the thicket. And so, therefore, Isaac would be spared when Abraham went and took the lamb and put it upon the altar. So, in the meantime, cling to your roots that your days may be long and that you will prosper in everything you set your hand to do. We'll see you next time. Shalom Aleichem. Bye.